The Mutant Millennia by Aldiss. To see the universe and see it whole, nothing in it was man's, yet at that time it could only appear that he had inherited it. For earth itself, or Yinisfar, as it was henceforth called, nothing but buoyant optimism suited the day. Terrestrials, having been granted federation, now possessed Galingua, which looked like the ultimate key to everything. They spread out into a galaxy peculiarly vulnerable to new forces. As has been observed, galactic civilization had reached a period of stasis, a point of stasis, though its resources were inexhaustible. Its initiative was not. The patterns of the self-perpetuating war wove unceasing artistries of circumstance capable of carrying whole societies along in a mirage of meaningful existence. The Yinisfarians did not burst, therefore, into a dynamic system, but into a glorified land of Nod. The results might have been predicted. Over the next 600 generations, Yinisfarians amassed more and more power to themselves. By peaceful means, or by means little better than piracy, they worked their way into the high galactic positions, succeeding less through their own intrinsic superiority than through the indifference of their rivals. This was a halcyon age, the age of the fulfillment of Yinisfar. As the years passed and Yinisfar conquered by commerce, its attitudes insensibly underwent modifications. Then came the blow that forced man to alter his attitude towards himself. His metaphysical view of being had, of course, been continually subject to change. But now the terrible moment arrived when he was revealed to himself in an entirely new light, as an alien, in a hostile environment. It is useful that this next fragment reminds us, incidentally, that if the universe appeared to rest in human hands, humanity was never alone or unregarded. There were always things that could see through. There were always things that could see, though they had no faces, and understand, though they had no brains. It was one of those unlikely accidents that are likely to occur anywhere. The undersea trawler Bartolomeo was approaching the subport of Cape Verde at 490 fathoms when it developed engine trouble. I am not a technical man, so that I cannot exactly describe the fault. Apparently, uranium slugs move slowly through the piles of these ships, and the dispensing mechanism which shoots the used slugs into the separators become jammed. Instead of using a manual remote control to tackle the fault, the chief engineer, a man called Joverad, went in himself to clear the slugway. As he climbed through the inspection hatches, Regard snagged his protective suit on a latch without noticing it. He was able to repair the congestion in the slugway without trouble, but collapsed as he emerged again, having collected a near-lethal dose of radiation in his kidneys. The Bartolomeo carried no doctor. A general call for one was sent out immediately. I have said I am no technician. Neither am I a philosopher. Yet I can see in this trivial episode, which began so many centuries of troubles, the pattern of all great changes which start as something fairly insignificant. In the midst of the shifting and immemorial sands of the Sahara Desert crouches the Ahagari Plateau, breasting the dunes like a liner in a sullen sea. On the edge of the plateau stands Baba Baba, the Institute of Medical Meditation, an elaborate and ancient building in the grand 51st epoch manner as frugal as Angkor Wat, as uncompromising as the lunar interventual, set about with palms, which lend shade to its rival paved walks. Baba thrust its towers and upper stories above the trees to scan the mighty continent on which it stands, just as its occupants, the doctors, scan the interior of the body, the inner continent of man. Gerard Gyers, neckcloth perpetually mopping his brow, stood before the main steps of the Institute, waiting. His air car, which had brought him and stood some distance off in the park. He waited humbly in the rocking heat. Although he was a proud man, no layman was ever allowed in Baba. At length, the figure Gerund expected to see appeared at the top of the wide steps. It was his wife, Cyril. She turned back as if to bid someone behind her farewell, and then commenced to descend the steps. As always, when Gerund met her here, he was conscious of how Cyril, as she came down those steps, had to force her mind out from the cloister of Baba back into the external world. While he watched with anxiety and love, the curve of her back straightened, her head came up, her pace increased. By the time she reached Gerund, her eyes held that familiar expression of detached amusement with which she faced both life and her husband. "It feels like weeks since I saw you," Cyril said, kissing Gerund on the mouth and putting her arms around him. "It is weeks," he protested. "Is it really?" she said playfully. "It doesn't seem as long." Gerund took her hand and led her around to the massive triangle that was their air car. The month of meditation which Cyril, as a doctor, was compelled to undergo every year was undoubtedly beneficial for her, based on high ego systems. The disciplines of Baba were courses of refreshment for brains and bodies of the medical fraternities of the world. Cyril looked younger and more vital than ever. Gerund told himself that after 6 years of marriage, he was less a source of vitality in his wife's life than was high ego, but it was irrational to hope for any change in that respect. Walking together, they reached the air car. Jeffy, their bonded servant, was leaning against the metal hull, awaiting them, arms patiently folded. "It's nice to see you again, Dr. Cyril," he said, opening the door for them and standing back. "And you, Jeffy. You're looking brown." "Baked right through," he said, smiling broadly. His homeland was a bleak northern island lying under the frost most of the year. Equatorial tour suited him well. Though it was 30 years since he had been brought from that distant land, Jeffy still spoke its simple patois, Unglesh. He had been unable to acquire the Galingua, in which Gerund, Cyril, and most civilized people of the day thought and conversed. They climbed into their seats, Jeffy taking the pilot's throne. He was a great slow man who moved purposefully. His sluggish mentality had let him fit for nothing but the role of a bonded servant, yet he handled the heavy flyer with delicacy. Jeffy now brought them over to one of the semicircular lake takeoff collars, which would absorb their exhaust gases. The orange signal came through on the collar beacon, and they burst immediately into vertical flight. At once the trees and the white and grey walls of Baba dwindled away below them, as inconsiderable as a child's charade between the limitless sandwich of sky and sand. The plane headed due west, on a course that would bring them eventually to the Gyres' home in the Puterska Islands, or would have brought them there but for the sick man, 1,000 meters under the bland surface of the Lanark Sea, a sick man of whose very existence they were as yet unaware. "Well, Gerund, what has happened in the world since I've been out of it?" Cyril asked, settling herself carefully opposite her husband. "Nothing very exciting. The duelist wished to register every planet in the Federation. The Barrier Research City has been opened with due pomp, and the world of learning is at loggerheads over Pamlira's new book, Power Evolution." "I must certainly read it," Cyril said with a trace of excitement. "What's his theory this time?" "It's one of those things that don't summarize easily," Gerund told her. "But briefly, Pamlira accepts the plateau position of the dual theory and claims that evolution is working toward greater consciousness. Plants are less conscious than animals, animals less conscious than men, and men came after the animals, which came after the plants. Plants, animals, men are only first steps in the long ladder. Millennia points out that man is by no means fully conscious. He sleeps. He forgets. He is unaware of the workings of his body. Which is why we doctors exist, Cyril inserted. Exactly. As Millennia himself says, only certain unusual individuals, associated higher into our present orders of medicine, can to some extent participate consciously in somatic activity. She smiled a neutral smile. And where does he go from there? She asked. He postulates that the next evolutionary step would be something, a being, conscious in every cell, and that nature may already preparing to usher it in onto the stage. The time apparently is ripe for the new being. Already? She raised a quizzical eyebrow. I should have thought he was a few million years early. Have all the permutations of which man is capable been played through already? Millennia spends half the book explaining why the new species is due. Gawain said, according to him, evolution accelerates like scientific progress. The more protoplasm available for modification, the sooner the modification appears. On 30,000 planets, you have quite a weight of protoplasm. Cyril was silent. With a slight ache in his heart, Gawain noticed that she asked him nothing about his personal opinion of Millennia's book, though it might have been clear from what he said that he had read it. She would consider that his opinion, as an industrial ecologist, was not worth having, and refused to yield enough to convention to ask him anyway. Finally, Cyril said, whatever this superconscious new species might be, man would give it little chance to establish its supremacy or even to survive. It would be blotted out before it had a chance to multiply. After all, we could hardly be expected to be hospitable to the usurpers of our comfortable place in the cosmos. Millennia says, Gawain told her, that evolution would take care of that if it really wanted man out of the way. The new species would be given some sort of defense or weapon to render it invulnerable against the species it would be superseding. How? She asked indignantly, as if he had said something stupid. Evolution is completely neutral. Mind, process. That blind process. That's what worries Millennia, Gawain said. He could see she considered this remark superficial. So it was. It had been designed to cover his uncertainty of what Millennia had actually said on the point. Power evolution was stiff reading. Gawain not only waded through it for Cyril's sake, because he knew the subject would interest her. Power evolution and its attendant woes were to be driven out of both their minds. Geoffrey appeared, framed bulkily in the door, dividing the control room from the cabin, while the air car roared on above the Sarah on autopilot. There's a call coming in for a doctor, he said, trundling his words out one by one. It's coming from a Cape Verde subport, almost dead ahead. They've got an underseaman in urgent need of healing. He looked at Cyril as he spoke. Of course I'll take it, she said, getting up and rushing past him into the control room. The call was coming through again as she reached the vidscreen. She listened carefully to it and then answered. Thank you, Dr. Gyers, the Cape Verde operator said relievedly. We'll wait for your arrival. They were now only some 600 miles from the Cape Verde island. Already they had covered nearly twice the distance from Barbara. Even as Cyril left the vidscreen, the Atlantic Sea showed ahead. On this desolate stretch of the continental coast, the saddest on Unisphere for all its blinding sun, the desert stretched right to the water's edge, or, to take it conversely, the beach extended from here to Barbara. They flashed across the dividing line between the sand and the sea and headed west-southwest. Almost at once, a cloud formed like a floor below them, blotting out the turning globe. Within 10 minutes, checking his instruments, Geoffrey took them down, finally skimming under low nimbostratus to find the 14 islands of the Cape Verde archipelago to their left ahead. Nicely calculated, Gawain said. Jeff played the micro-navigator like a child genius conjuring a ritzy pop 2 from a solo organ. He had that flair for machines only granted to the half-witted. The air car banked to port around Satago and plunged toward the sea, dropping vertically. The grey waters came up to meet them like a smack in the face, boiled around them, swallowed them, and the altimeter finger on the instrument panel, swooping past the 0 sign, began to read fathoms instead of meters. Geoffrey was in radio contact with his subport again. Beacons at 10-fathom intervals lit their way down to the underwater city. Finally, a hangar poised above a 100-fathom gulf loomed Whale's mouth wide in front of them. They jetted in and the jaws closed behind them. Powerful valves immediately began to suck the water from the hangar, replacing it with air. Already mentally composing herself for what was to come, Syra was out of the flyer before the dock and on the vacubile could collect the trapped fish and blow the floor dry. Gerund and Geoffrey were left to follow as best they could. Outside the hangar, 2 port officials greeted Syra. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Dr. Giles," one of them said. "They probably told you the details of the case over the tube. It's the chief engineer of the undersea trawler Bartolomeo who's in trouble." As he related the cogent facts of the case, the official ushered Syra, Gerund and Geoffrey aboard a small open vehicle. The other official drove, and they sped along the strange waterfront, where, despite all the usual bustle connected with the dock, no water could be seen. For ages, the human species had regarded the seas as either a perilous highway or a suitable place in which they could make hit-and-run raids on shoals of fish. Then, belatedly, it had taken the oceans in hand and tended them with the same care it bestowed on the land. Now they were farmed rather than fished. As more and more personnel turned to work on the savannas of the deep, so the subports had grown up underwater towns that paid little homage to their softer counterparts on dry land. Cape Verde subport, because of its favoured position in the Atlantic and its proximity to Little Union, the second greatest of Unifar cities, had been one of the first such ports to be established. The quarter of the city in which the open machine now stopped was more than 10 centuries old. The hospital into which they ushered presented a crumbling facade. Inside were the monastic arrangements usual to hospitals everywhere. From a cloister, doors gave onto a waiting room, a primitive kitchen, a radio room, small cells. In one of the cells lay Juvigard, the chief engineer of the Bartolomeo, with a dose of hard radiation in his kidneys. An ancient bondsman, bent and grey-bearded, announced himself as Laszlo. He was on duty. Apart from him and the sick man, the musty-smelling place was empty. "See what you can do for the poor fellow, Doctor," one of the officials said, shaking Syra's elegant hands as he prepared to depart. "I expect the captain of the Bartolomeo will call through soon. Meanwhile, we will leave you in peace." "Thank you," Syra said, a little blankly, her mind already far from them. She turned away, went into the sick man's cell, and closed the door behind her. For some time after she had gone and the officials had left, Gerard and Geoffrey stood aimlessly in the cloister. Geoffrey wandered to the archway and looked out at the street. Occasionally a bonded man or woman passed, glancing neither to the right nor the left. The duly lighted fronts of the buildings, many of them carved from the rock, looked like the dwellings of the dead. Geoffrey wrapped his great arms about his torso. "I want to go home," he said. "It's cold here." A bead of moisture fell from the roof overhead and splashed onto his cheek. "It's cold and damp here," he added. The grey-bearded guard regarded him speechlessly with a sardonic eye. For a long time there was no more speech. They waited almost without thought, their level of consciousness as dim as the lights outside. As soon as Syra Gowers entered the cell, she climbed onto the bunk with the sick man. Regard was a heavy fellow, Under the single blanket, his vast frame laboured up and down with the effort of breathing, the stubble on his face thrust up through great pallid jowls. Lying beside him, Saru felt like the Mahomet visiting the mountain. That the mountain was unconscious only made Saru's task easier. She placed her bare arm over Regard's bare arm and closed her eyes. She relaxed her muscles, slowing her breathing a rate. This was, of course, all standard professional procedure. Efficiently, Saru reduced the rate of her heartbeat, concentrating on that vital pulse until it seemed to grow and grow, and she could submerge herself in it. She was sinking down through a dull red haze, a featureless haze, a haze stretching from pole to pole, but gradually a mirage forming in the distance. Striations appeared through the haze. As her viewpoint sank, it magnified the islands of the blood slid up to meet her. The islands moved with the clerical purpose of vultures, expanding, changing, ranging, rearranging, and still she moved among them. Though she moved, all sense of direction was entirely shed. Here her dimensions carried no sense of up or down. Even near and far were confused to her sight, which was no longer sight. Not only sight had she lost, almost every other ability except volition had been stripped from her when she took this plunge into the somatic world of her own bodily universe, as a man throws off all his clothes before diving into a river. She could not think, remember, taste, touch, turn, communicate, or act, yet a shadow of all these things remained with her. Much as a dragonfly larva, climbing its reed out of the ooze, carries a vague image of the creature it will become. Saru had some memory of herself as the individual she had been, and this pale memory stayed with her by dint of the years of training she had received in medical meditation in Baba. Otherwise she would have been lost in that most terrible trap of all, the universe of one's own body. Almost without will, she headed down Urban Stream. It was swimming, flying, crawling, through an endless Everglade, flooded above the treetops, treacle thick with fish, minnow, mackerel, mace, and manta ray. It was creeping, climbing, drifting, down a glass crayon, whose walls flickered with more than earthly firelight. So, until before her loomed a wavering cliff. The cliff ran around the universe, tall as time, insubstantial as muslin, pockmarked with rabbit holes, through which phantasmic creatures came and went. She drifted through it almost without resistance, like plankton sucked through a sponge. Now she had passed her lobe of consciousness, her psyche, into Beauregard's arm, into his soma. Her surroundings were as weird, as strange, as familiar as they had been before. Submerged on the cellular level, there could be no difference between his body and hers, yet a difference was there. From the forests of his flesh, strange and always unseen eyes watched her, and a silent and malevolent regard traced her course, for she was an intruder, venturing into the interior of an alien world especially designed to show an intruder no mercy. Little jellies of death twinkled as she passed, and only the confidence of her advance held the defending powers at bay. As she moved on, corpuscles like stars about her, the surrounding activity grew more intense. She was swept along as by a glutinous current, moving under arches, among branches, past weed tangles, through nets, and the way ahead grew dark and stagnant, though she still drifted forward. The half-live things about her were squirming away, repulsed, flickering with crude blueprints of pain. She was nearly at the infected kidneys now. Only the stern disciplines of medical meditations now prompted her on. The atmosphere was so thickly repellent that she might have been wallowing in a sewer, but medicine had long ago discovered the powers of self-healing that lie within the body. High Ega and the yogas on which it was founded had pointed the way to releasing these powers. Nowadays, with the psyche of one of the order of the medicine to spur it on, a patient's body could be made to regenerate itself to grow a new limb, a new lung, a new liver. The doctors, the modern skin divers, submerged to marshal the forces of the anatomy against its invaders. Sarah called to those forces now, about her, layer on layer, horizon high. The cells of the invaded body, each with its 30,000 genes, lay silent and seemingly deserted. Then, slowly, reluctantly, as her summons persisted, reinforcements came to her like rats crawling out of a ruined city. The enemy is ahead. She pulsed to them, moving forward into the tattered darkness. More and more they were coming to her cause, lighting the sewer with its internal fires. Things like little bats hurtled, chittering out of the heart of the darkness, were struck down, were devoured, and then the enemy launched his assault. He struck with the suddenness of a closing trap. He was one, he was a million. He was nothing the textbooks know of, unknown, unknowable. He fought with laws and powers entirely his own. He was monstrous, bestial, occult, agreed with fangs, owned horror, newly hatched. He was so overwhelming that Sayo hardly felt fear. The presence of the unknown can kill everything but calm in us. She was aware only that a random radioactive particle had struck down and buried itself in the random gene, producing, with a ferocious defiance of the laws of chance, a freak cell, a mutant cell with unfamiliar appetites. Nothing in her training prepared her to understand what the appetites were. The appetites had lain dormant until she approached. She had triggered them, woken them. She had breathed her touch of consciousness onto them, and at once the cell had filled with its own awareness, and its awareness was of the desire to conquer. She could see, feel, hear, sense that it was tearing through cell after cell, a maniac through empty rooms, filling them with its rebellion. The healing forces about her turned and fled in panic, winging and swimming against a wind which held them helpless. Sorrow, too, turned to escape. Her own body was her only refuge, if she could get there. But the nail streamers came out of the darkness and wrapped themselves about her. She cracked open her jaws to their toothed extremes, struggling to scream. At once her mouth was filled with sponge, from which little creatures flung themselves and scampered wildly through her being, triumphing. Gerald and Jeffy sat smoking on a bench under the eyes of the grey-bearded bondman, Laszlo. Empty mugs stood beside them. Jeffy had boiled them a hot drink. Now they sat waiting uneasily for Cyril to reappear, their uneasiness growing as the time slipped away. "I've never known her to take so long on a case before," Gowan said. 5 minutes is generally all she needs. As soon as she organizes the powers of recovery, she comes back. "This engineer, he sounded pretty bad," Jeffy said. "Yes, but all the same, 5 minutes more and I'm going in to see her." "That's not permitted," declared the greybeard. It was almost the first time he had spoken. What was said was no less than the truth. The etiquette governing doctor and patient was strict, in their own interests. They could not be viewed together, unless by another doctor. Gownd was perfectly familiar with this rule. He had indeed a reluctance to see his wife in a trance state, and knowing that the sight would only serve to emphasize the constraint he felt between them. All the same, Cyril had been in that room for half an hour. Something must be done. He sat there for 2 more minutes before getting up and going over to the cell door. Laszlo also rose about her angrily. As he started to intercept Gowan, Jeffy blocked his way. "Sit down or I'll pull your nose off," Jeffy said unemotionally. "I'm very strong and I got nothing better to do." The old man, taking one look into Jeffy's face, went obediently back and sat down. Gowan nodded at his servant, opened the cell door and slipped inside. One glance told him that something was wrong, gravely wrong. His wife and the massive engineer lay side by side on the bunk, their arms touching. Their eyes were open, bulging coldly out into space like cod's eyes on a slab containing no life whatsoever, but their bodies were alive. Every so often their frames vibrated and bulged and settled again. Cyro's right heel kicked briefly against the bulk. against the bunk, beating a meaningless rat-tat on the wooden bed foot. Her skin was gradually suffusing with a crimson blush like a stain. It looked, thought Gowland, as if every shred of flesh in her body had been beaten to a pulp. For a while he stood there transfixed with horror and fear, unable to collect his wits and decide what to do. A cockroach swarmed up the leg of the bed. It passed within 6 inches of Beauregard's foot, which protruded bare from under his blanket. As the cockroach moved by, a section of the sole of the big foot suddenly grew into a stalk, a dainty thing like a blade of grass. The stalk licked out as quickly as a tongue and caught the cockroach, its legs waving. Gowland slid quietly to the ground in a faint. Now the flesh on the bed began to change more rapidly. It had organized itself, it slid and smeared out of shape, or flowed in on itself with smacking noises. The cockroach was absorbed, then compressing itself, the mass formed back into one human form. Cyro's face, body, colour of hair, eyes, all became like Cyro's, and every drop of flesh was squeezed into her making. As her last fingernail formed, Gowland rolled over and sat up. Surprise seized him as he stared about the cell. It had seemed to him that he had been senseless only a second, yet the sick man had gone. At least Cyro looked better now. She was smiling at him. Perhaps, after all, his anxiety had produced some kind of optical illusion when he entered the cell. Perhaps everything was all right, but on looking more closely at Cyro, his returning sense of reassurance vanished. It was uncanny. The person sitting on the bed was Cyro, and yet, every line of her face, every subtle contour Gowland loved so well, had undergone an indefinable transmutation. Even the texture of her flesh had changed. He noticed that her fingers had grown, and there was another thing. She was too big. She was too thick and too tall to be Cyro, as she sat on the bed looking at him, trying to smile. Gowland stood up, faintness threatening to overwhelm him again. He was close to the door. He could run, or he could call for Jeffy, as his instincts hid him. Instead, he conquered his instincts. Cyro was in trouble, supreme trouble. Here was Gowland's chance, possibly his final one, to prove his devotion to her. If he ran from her now, his chance would have passed forever. Or so he told himself, for Gowland could not believe his wife's indifference rested on anything but a distrust of his integrity. He turned back to her, ignoring her frightfulness. Cyro, what is wrong? He asked. What can I do? Tell me what I can do to help. I'll do anything. The creature on the bed opened its mouth. I shall be better in a minute, it said huskily. The words did not quite coincide with his lips' movements. With a heave, it stood on its feet. It was over 7 feet tall and burly, and Gowland stared at it, as if hypnotized, but managed with an effort of will to hold out a hand to it. It's my wife, he told himself. It's only my wife. But as it lumbered towards him, his nerve broke. The look on its face was too terrible. He turned too late to get away. It stretched out its arms and caught him, almost playfully. In the cloister, Geoffrey was growing bored. For all the affection he bore his master, he found the life of a bondservant a tedious one at times. Under the fishy eye of the old guard, he spread himself along the bench, preparing for a nap. Gowland would call him soon enough when he was wanted. A bell rang in the radio room. Casting one last suspicious look at Geoffrey, the old man went to answer the call. Geoffrey settled back to doze. In a minute, scuffling sounds made him open an eye. A monstrous form, in details lost in the feeble lighting, lumped along on 8 or 10 legs and vanished into the street. Geoffrey was on his feet instantly, a wave of cold horror brushing tenderly over his skin. He turned and made at a run for the sick cell, instinctively connecting his monster with the threat to those he served. The cell was empty. "Here, what are you up to?" asked a voice behind him. The grey beard had come up at the sound of Geoffrey's footsteps. He peered past Geoffrey's elbow into the room. As soon as he saw it was empty, he pulled out a whistle and began to blow wildly on it. Judge: You offer as an explanation of the disappearance of your master and mistress the possibility that they may have been devoured by this monster you claim you saw. I didn't say that, sir. I don't know where they went to. I only say I saw this thing slipping out into the hospital, and then they were gone. Judge: You have heard that no one else in the Soaport has seen any such monster. You have heard the evidence of Laszlo, the hospital guard, that he saw no such monster. Why then do you persist in this tale? Geoffrey: I can only say what happened, can't I? Judge: You are supposed to say what happened. Geoffrey: That is what happened. It's the truth. I've no secrets, nothing to hide. I was fond of my master. I would never have done away with him, or my mistress. Judge: Bonded servants have expressed such sentiments before, after their masters were dead. If you are innocent of what you are accused of, why did you attempt to escape when old Laszlo blew his whistle for the police? Geoffrey: I was rattled, sir. Do you understand? I was frightened. I'd seen this thing, and then I'd seen the empty cell, and then that fool started blowing. I just hit him without thinking. Judge: You do not reveal yourself as a responsible man. We have heard already the witness Laszlo's account of the way you threatened him with the force soon after you arrived at the hospital. Geoffrey: And you've heard me tell you why I did so. Judge: You realize, I hope, the serious position you are in. You are a simple man, so I will put it to you simply. Under world law, you are charged with the double murder of your master and mistress, and until their bodies are recovered for further evidence comes to light, you are to be housed in our prison. There were two ways up from the subport to the surface of the Lanark. One way was the sea route, by which both the Bartolomeo and the Sipgarus plane had arrived. The other was a land route, an underground funicular railway climbed to 3,000 feet of rock from the submerged city to the station in Praia, the capital of the city of Satago. It was by this route that Geoffrey was brought to prison. Overlooking the duty courtyard, sheltered by a baobab, Geoffrey's cell windows allowed him to glimpse of the sea. It was good to be above ground again, although the cloudy overcast created a greenhouse atmosphere, which was particularly oppressive after the cool air of the subport. Geoffrey sweated perpetually. He spent a lot of his time standing on his wooden bed, staring out into the heat. Other convicts, out for exercise, talked to each other under his window in the local lingua Criolla, but Geoffrey understood not a word of it. Towards the evening of the second day of his confinement, Geoffrey was at his usual perch when a wind arose. It blew hotly through the prison and continued to blow. The heavy cloud was shredded away, revealing the blue of the sky for the first time in days. The chief guard, a swarthy man with immense moustache, came out into the courtyard, sampled the air, approved, and strolled over to a stone seat under the baobab tree. Dusting it carefully with his handkerchief, he lay down and relaxed. On top of the wall behind the guard something moved. A thing like a python uncoiled itself and began to drop down into the courtyard. It seemed to spread over the wall like a stain as it came, but the heavy foliage of the baobab made it difficult to see what was happening. It looked to Geoffrey as if a rubbery curtain set with jewels and starfish were gliding down the wall. Now it landed behind the guard. Whatever this thing was, it raised a flapper like a snake about to strike and clamped it over the unsuspecting guard's face. Then the rest of its bulk flowed over the man, damping his struggles and covering him like a cloak. Geoffrey cried out furiously from his cell, but no one answered. No one cared. Most of the staff were down on the waterfront with their girls. When the thing slid off the chief guard, only a limp and flattened body lay on the bench. The hot wind trifled with its moustaches. The thing grew fingers and expertly removed the ring of keys from the dead man's belt. A segment of it then detached itself even from the main bulk, which remained in the shadow as the segment scampered across the yard with the keys. It looked like an animated stool. "My God," Geoffrey said, "it's coming here." As he backed away from the window to his cell door, the creature with one bound appeared between the bars and dropped the keys into the cell. It jumped in after them. Bit by bit more of the thing arrived, dropping down before Geoffrey's petrified gaze and finally building onto Gowand, or an intolerable replica of him. Gowand put out a hand and touched his servant, almost as if he was experimenting. "It's all right, Geoffrey," he said at last, speaking with obvious effort. "You have nothing to fear. No harm will come to you. Take these keys, unlock your cell door, and come with me up to the warden of the prison." Grey in the face, shaken like a leaf, Geoffrey managed to pull himself together enough to obey. The keys rattling in his hand, he tried them one by one in his lock until he found a key that fitted. Like a man mesmerized, he led the way into the corridor, the pseudo-Gowand following closely behind. No one was about. At one point a guard slept in a tipped-back chair, his heels resting high above his head on the whitewashed wall. They did not disturb him. They unlocked the big barrel door at the foot of a private staircase and so ascended into the warden's office. Open doors showed them the way to a balcony overlooking the bay and the central peaks of the island. On the balcony, alone as usual, drinking wine as usual, a man sat in a wicker chair. He looked small and, yes, alas, infinitely tired. "Are you the prison warden?" Gowand asked, stumping into the room. "Am," I said. He looked at me for a long while. I could tell then that he was not. What shall I say? Not an ordinary human being. He looked what he was, a forgery of a human being. Even so, I recognized him as Gowand Giles from the photographs the police had circulated. "Will you both take a chair?" I asked. "It fatigues me to see you standing." Neither servant nor master moved. How have you released your man?" I asked. "I brought him before you," Gowand said, "so that you may hear what I have to say, and so that you may know that Tiffy is a good servant, has never done me harm. I want him released forthwith." So this was a reasonable creature, which had compassion. Human or no, it was something I could talk to. So many men with whom I have to deal have neither reason nor compassion. "I am prepared to listen," I said, pouring myself more wine. "As you see, I have little else to do. Listening can be even pleasanter than talking." Whereupon Gowand began to tell me everything I have now set down here to the best of my ability. Geoffrey and I listened in silence, though the bondman undoubtedly understood little. I grasped quite enough to make my inside turn cold. After all, was not my copy of Paul Millennia's work on power evolution lying at my elbow? In the quiet that fell when Gowand finished, we heard the sunset Angelus ringing out from the prior steeple. It brought me no anodyne, and the hard, hot wind carried its notes away. I knew already that the darkness was falling that no prayers would lighten. "So then," I said, finding my voice, "as warden, the first point I must make is that you, Gowand Giles, as I must call you, have committed murder, on your own admission. You killed my chief guard." "Why do you think that is?" I asked stiffly. He grew a smile on his face. I averted my eyes from it. "We learn fast," he said. "We cannot absorb humans who are not conscious of themselves as part of the process of nature. If they cling to an outmoded idea of man as a species apart their cells are antagonistic to ours and absorption will not take place. Do you mean to tell me you can only absorb cultured man? I asked. Exactly. With animals it is different. Their consciousness is only a natural process. They offer us no obstacle. I believe it was at this point that Jeffy jumped over the balcony rail into the bushes below. He picked himself up unhurt, and we watched his massive frame dwindle from the road as he ran away. Neither of us spoke. I hoped he might go to bring help, but if Gavin thought of that, he gave no sign. Really, I don't think I understand what you mean at all, I said, playing for time, and I don't think I did grasp it then. To tell you the truth, I was feeling so sick that the whole prison seemed to reel about around me. This heavy pseudo-man made me more frightened than I knew I could be. Though I feared neither life nor death before the half alive, I was shivering with the chill of horror. I don't understand about absorbing only cultured people, I said, almost at random. This time it did not bother to open its mouth to answer. Culture implies fuller understanding. Today there is, culturally speaking, only one way to that understanding through Galingula. I can only liberate the cells of those who are able to use that semantic tool. Those who hold biochemical bondage has already been made malleable by it. The accident that happened to J-Regard releases abilities already latent in every Galingua-speaking person throughout the galaxy. Here and now on Yenisvar, a giant step ahead has been taken, unexpected, yet the inevitable climax to the employment of Galingua. So then, I said, feeling better as I began to comprehend, you are the next evolutionary step, as predicted by Palmyra in a power evolution. Roughly speaking, yes, I said. He said, I have the total awareness Palmyra spoke of. Each of my cells has that gift, therefore I am independent of fixed form, that bane of every multicelled creature before me. I shook my head. You seem to be not in advance but a retrogression, I said. Man is, after all, a complex gene hive. You are saying you can turn into single cells, but single cells are very early forms of life. All my cells are aware, he said emphatically. That's the difference. Genes build themselves into cells into the gene hive called man in order to develop their potentialities, not man's. The idea of man's being able to develop was purely an anthropomorphic concept. Now the cells are finished with this shape and called man. They have exhausted its possibilities and are going on to something else. To this there seemed nothing to say, so I quietly sipping my drink and watching the shadows. I sat quietly sipping my drink and watching the shadows grow, spreading from the mountains out to sea. I was still cold, but no longer shaking. Have you nothing else to ask me? Gerwent inquired, almost with puzzlement in his voice. You hardly expect to hear a monster sound puzzled. Yes, I said, just one thing. Are you happy? The silence, like the shadows, extended itself toward the horizon. I mean, I amplified, if I had a hand in modelling a new species, I'd try and make something more capable of happiness than man. Curious creatures that we are, our best moments come about when we are striving for something. When the thing's achieved, we are full of unrest again. There is a divine discontent, but divine content comes only to the beasts of the pasture, who regardlessly crop down snails with their grass. The more intelligent a man is, the more open he is to doubt. Conversely, the bigger fool he is, the more likely he is to be pleased with his lot. So I'm asking, are you, new species, happy? Yes, Gerwin said positively. As yet I am but 3 people. Regard, Cyril, Gerwin. The last 2 have struggled for years for full integration, as do all human couples, and now have found it, a fuller integration than was ever feasible before. What humans instinctively seek, we instinctively have. We are the completion of a trend. We can never be anything but happy. no matter how many people we absorb. Keeping my voice steady, I said, "You'd better start absorbing me then, since that must be what you intend." "Eventually all human cells will come under the new regime," Gawain said, "but first, the word of what is happening must be spread to make people receptive to it. To soften further what Galingua has already softened. Everyone must know, so that we can carry out the absorption process. That is your duty. You're a civilized man. Warden, you must write to Pamliwa for a start explaining what has occurred. Pamliwa will be interested." He paused. 3 cars swept up the road and turned into the main gates of the prison. Jeffy, then, had had enough intelligence to go for help. "Supposing I will not aid you," I asked, "why should I hurry man's extinction? Supposing I acquaint the Galfed Council with the truth and get them to blow the whole island to bits. It would be simple. Get out. A simple matter." Confound it. We were suddenly surrounded by butterflies. In impatiently brushing them away, I had knocked over my bottle of wine. The air was full of thousands of butterflies, fluttering around like paper. The darkening sky was thick with them. The angriest gestures of the hand could not clear them away. "What is this?" Gawain spluttered. For the first time I personally saw him out of shape as he grew another attachment to wave the dainty creatures off. It sprouted from what had been his ear and flailed the air about his head. I can only say I was nauseated. It cost me the greatest effort to keep a grip on myself. "As a creature so aware of nature," I said, "you should enjoy this spectacle. These are painted lady butterflies, blown in thousands off their migratory tracks. We get them here most years. This hot wind, which we call the Mutant, carries them westward across the ocean from the continent." Now I could hear people running up the stairs. They would be able to deal suitably with this creature, whose reasonable words were so in contrast to his unreasonable appearance. I continued speaking more loudly, so that, if possible, he would be taken unawares. It's not entirely a misfortune for the butterflies. There are so many of them. No doubt they have eaten most of their food on the mainland, and would have starved had they not been carried here by the wind. An admirable example of nature looking after its own. "Admirable," he echoed. I could scarcely see him for bright wings. The rescue party was in the next room. They burst out with Jeffy at their head, carrying automatic weapons. "There he is," I shouted. But he was not there. Regard, Cyril Gerund had gone. Taking a tip from the painted ladies, he had split into 1,000 units, volplaning away on the breeze, safely, invincibly, lost among the crowd of bright insects. So I came to what is really not the end, but the beginning of the story. Already a decade had passed since the events in the Cape Verde island. What did I do? Well, I did nothing. I neither wrote to Palmyra nor called Galfed Council. With the marvellous adaptability of my species, I managed in a day or two to persuade myself that Gerund would never succeed, or that somehow or other he had misinterpreted what was happening to him. And so, year by year, I hear the reports of the human race growing fewer, and I think, well, anyway, they're happy. And I sit up here on my balcony and drink my wine and let the sea breezes blow on me. In this climate and at this point, nothing more should be expected of me. And why should I excite myself for a cause in which I have never believed? Where nature passes a law, it cannot be repealed. For her prisoners there is no escape, and we are all her prisoners. So I sit tight and take another drink. There is only one proper way to become extinct. With dignity.